Hi everyone. Today I'll be talking to you about tone. So let's talk about tone. What about it? So first we're going to talk about what it is. We're actually going to define it and how we might describe it. So what is it? We're going to be talking a little bit about characteristic tone, which is about what does each instrument sound like, individual tone. So, what does each musician sound like? And then, how we refine and practice our tone. So, how do we actually improve it? How do we go about creating our tone? So, the first thing I want to discuss is the concept of timbre. I'll be using timbre and tone pretty interchangeably. They mean essentially the same thing. So, timbre is the quality of tone distinctive of a particular singing voice or musical instrument. The reason we have timbre and we don't always use tone is because tone can be confused with pitch. So, like a tone as in a note or a pitch. So, timbre is the best way to really say sound quality or tone, but I'll be using them interchangeably. So, how do we describe it? We know how to define it, but now we have to know how to talk about it. So, we use adjectives that make the abstract more concrete. So, metaphors. Tone isn't something you can see or touch, it's just something that you hear or feel or experience. So we use words like warm or cold, bright or dark, brassy or reedy, thin or full. And we call this timbre sound quality or tone color. Again, these things are interchangeable with each other. They all mean the same thing. And these are some of the words we use to describe them. We speak in metaphors. So obviously, the tone isn't physically warm or physically cold. It's more about the emotion and the affect that we're going for. So imagine this. If you were listening to someone playing an instrument and you couldn't see them, say you were standing on opposite sides of a closed door, how would you know what instrument they were playing and what would you listen for? You would probably be able to tell exactly what instrument they're playing, even though you wouldn't be able to see them. And that's probably because you're recognizing their tone. So, what is the characteristic tone of each instrument? What are the things that make all tubas sound similar or all violas sound similar? Here we're going to listen to a few examples of the characteristic tones of each of the different instruments. I got these recordings from the Philharmonia London sound sample website. They have lots of great sound samples there. I just picked a few for each instrument. So let's take a listen to the cello. So some of the words I use to describe that are vibrant, round, and singing. Obviously, the cello isn't actually singing, but there are qualities of the tone that make it sound like it's a human voice. Let's listen to the bass drum. That's a fun one. So this is dark and rich and mighty. It's not really rich. It's not rich in the money sense. It's rich in the like gallon of dark chocolate kind of way. Let's listen to the French horn. So to me, that sounds mellow, covered, and warm. The horn is actually meant to sound like it's really far away, and I think we can tell through its tone that that's kind of what it does, and that's its use in most music and ensembles. Last, we're going to listen to the oboe. So I said that was clear, piercing, and full. It's almost a little nasally. It becomes less nasally the more advanced you become on the instrument, but it still has its own distinct tone quality, and none of these instruments sound even anything like the other. You can tell that they are all different. What about instruments that are more closely related? They're a little bit more similar. We're going to consider the flugelhorn and the trumpet. Both are played by trumpet players. They're both asked for in ensembles, but they have very different tone qualities. We're going to listen to this man, David Allison, play both. The first one that he played was the flugelhorn, which I thought was much more mellow, dark, thick, and rich. You could tell it looked a little bit different, but it sounded very different from the trumpet, which is more intense and bright, brilliant and stately. Completely different sound qualities. What about the same instrument? Now, when two musicians play the same instrument, their tones will still be unique to them. So you'll be able to tell that two people are playing, let's say, the flute, but you might be able to tell who's actually playing the flute based on their individual tone. This is individual tone. For example, the human voice. So you can tell a lot of things about me from the sound of my voice. You can probably tell my gender, that I'm a woman, my age, I'm in my early 20s. From my accent, you might be able to tell that I'm from Western New York. I speak mostly through my nose, but my voice still sounds completely different from other women who are around my age and from the same area. It's individual and unique to me. Even though my sister is pretty close to me in age and she's also a woman, we're from the same place, our voices sound different and you can tell us apart from one another. So we're going to do a listening exercise of two performances of the Mozart Clarinet Concerto by two professional clarinetists. And while you're listening, pay attention to the characteristic tone of the clarinet as well as each performer's individual tone. If you weren't looking at them, you would still be able to tell it was a clarinet being played. What about it sounded like a clarinet? And what about them sounded different from each other? What words would you use to describe their tones? And what do you like about each performance? Maybe you don't actually like anything about either of them, or maybe you prefer one over the other. And that's actually a good thing. That's you discovering your preferences, your style, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. And the two recordings we're listening to, one is by Anthony McGill and Sharon Calm. We'll be listening to Sharon Calm first. We'll just be listening to the exposition. Okay, now let's take a listen to Anthony McGill's version. So let's talk about what we heard in both recordings. To me, they both sounded clear, brilliant, round, and rich. These are all things that I consider characteristic clarinet tone. That's how I could tell they weren't playing the saxophone or the bassoon. Sharon Calm's version, it's a little bit brighter, more mellow, gentle, whereas Anthony McGill's is a bit darker, focused, and piercing. So I encourage you to do this for your own instrument, for a variety of different recordings and performances. Find two people or more playing the same piece and figure out what's the same and what's different. And you might have a preference. You might say, oh, I'd rather play like Sharon Calm, or I'd rather play like Anthony McGill, which is really great. And that's part of the process of figuring out what you like and what you want to sound like eventually. So how do we go about listening to tone? What are the things we're listening for? So what is the characteristic tone of your instrument? That's the first thing. Listen to a variety of recordings and performances, people from all over the world and from different time periods. A recording from 2019 is going to sound a lot different than something from, say, the 60s or the 70s. Styles have changed, recordings have changed, and you might like one more than the other. Keep a log of which performers are your favorites and least favorites. I certainly have performers and recordings that I prefer over others, and that's just my taste. It doesn't mean they're not good musicians. It's just what I like and what I would like to recreate. What do you like about it? And what don't you like? You should be able to justify and really explore what it is you like about it, what it is you don't. That way you can apply it to your own playing. And what are they trying to communicate through their tone? It wouldn't make sense to play a sad piece the same way we would play something really exciting and triumphant. It just wouldn't be appropriate, and we wouldn't be able to communicate to the listener what we're trying to say. So that's another part of tone. As we can hear in the Mozart, it's very bright and cheerful and happy, but they might not always have that same tone for maybe even the second movement of that concerto, which is a different character. And what would you like your tone to sound like? That's really the question here. So you listen to yourself, record yourself, reflect, keep a log of what you notice. It's going to be a little awkward because recording yourself is not super fun, and looking at yourself and listening to yourself isn't always that easy, but it's really, really helpful. Be your own critic, be your own teacher. Work towards a goal. Maybe say, I want to sound like Anthony McGill today. Have that in your mind and be like, this is what I want. Visualize your tone. Can you tell a story? Can you depict a character? Can you imagine a place? Really paint a picture for yourself and for your listener. So this is a whole lot of thinking about tone, but how do we actually do tone? Scales. So your major and minor scales, your chromatic scales, it doesn't have to be super crazy fast. You don't have to do the hard ones. Something that you're a little bit more comfortable with. That way you can let your fingers do the work and everything else. And that way you can really focus your attention on your tone. Long tone exercises. Tone is even in the name. The whole purpose of this is to try to get an even, consistent tone and a tone that you like. So try these in different ranges. Probably on your instrument, the lowest part of your range and the highest part of your range are going to have different tone colors. And try it with different dynamics. Pianissimo to fortissimo, those are two different characters, two different sounds, and two different tones. Use your voice. This is something us instrumentalists don't like to do a whole lot. It's not something we're asked to do a lot when we're learning how to play our instrument, but if you can use your voice to determine what you want to sound like, that'll be really helpful, especially with setting goals. It doesn't have to be the most beautiful thing in the world. It's just for you to paint a picture, to plan what you want to do. Play slowly. This does not have to be fast. In fact, it should not be. You should be able to take your time and really focus on each note and making that note as beautiful as it possibly can be. Use a metronome if you need to. The metronome is your friend. Set it really, really slow. Play whole notes. Play as slowly as you need to. That way you can really focus your attention just on tone. Experiment, and we'll be talking about this in just a sec. Change something about your playing. If you're playing the exact same way and you're expecting to get a different tone, it's not going to happen magically. And as we already mentioned, listen to yourself, record yourself. Something I like to do is I like to close my eyes while I'm playing. I've noticed that not only does it help me focus on my tone and my sound and what I'm doing, but it's actually kind of meditative and it's really peaceful and it gets me in the really good mindset to continue the rest of my practice session. So more on experimenting as promised. What are the variables we can change in our playing to get different tone colors? So if we change one thing at a time, what does it do? And this is going to be different for each instrument or each family of instruments. So I'm just going to speak a little bit broadly about different kinds of instruments and some of the things you might change. This is not taking into account different mouthpieces or different types of strings. Equipment will play a big part of it, but even more than that, what you're doing with your body and what you're trying to communicate musically will be the most important indicator. So for our woodwind and brass friends, number one, embouchure. So how are the corners of your mouth? What is your chin doing? If you have a really well-developed embouchure, chances are you're going to be able to manipulate tone much better and get a more characteristic tone. rather than if you don't have a very well developed embouchure. Your tongue position. Where is your tongue in your mouth? Is it more up or is it flat on the bottom of your mouth? Kind of similarly, what syllable are you saying? Is it more of an E or an ah or an O? All of these are going to have completely different tone qualities. The air speed and the air amount. So you can use really fast air and a lot of air, or you can really use really fast air, but not that much of it. We usually do this for dynamics and different registers, but it also creates a different tone color. For strings, there's three really big ones. So bow speed, bow pressure, and contact point. So by bow speed, we might think about how much bow we're actually using. If we're not using that much bow, chances are we're going really slow. Whereas if we're using the whole bow, we're going really fast because we have to travel faster. Bow pressure, that's usually how much pressure is coming from our first finger onto the actual string. We don't want to say weight, we want to say pressure. How much pressure is actually on there? If it's really light, we're going to get a lighter sound. If there's more pressure, harder sound. Contact point, where is it between the bridge and the fingerboard? Closer to the bridge, it's going to be a little louder, a little bit fuller. Opposite if it's closer to the fingerboard. I put in bow angle here because it's really hard to manipulate your bow if your bow is not straight. And by straight, I mean parallel to the bridge. If your bow is crooked, you're not going to be able to produce a very clear tone. And percussion, yes, percussion instruments do have tone and we can change the tone. It's not entirely fixed. So the type of mallet will play a big part. I know I said I wasn't going to mention equipment, but normally percussionists are equipped with a whole bunch of different mallets and sticks. So the head of the mallet, whether it's yarn, metal, or rubber, those are all going to create very different sounds. Where you're actually hitting the instrument, take a snare drum. If you're hitting really close to the center, it's going to create a much fuller and very different sound. Whereas if you're playing closer to the rim, it's going to be a lot lighter. It's going to be much more subtle. By speed or velocity, I'm talking about how fast are you actually hitting the instrument. If you're kind of coming a little bit more slow, it's going to create a different sound, a different affect. Intensity, what I mean by that is kind of how far are you hitting it from? How much force are you using against the instrument? All of these are going to create different tones, among other things. Tone is intimately related to things like dynamics and phrasing and intonation. So all of these things are related and all of them combined will create a different tone. So to go over what we just talked about, each instrument has its own characteristic tone, whereas each musician has their own individual tone as well as the characteristic tone of their instrument. We describe tone or timbre using metaphors, so like bright and dark. We're not actually changing the lighting in wherever we are. It's a metaphor to describe something very abstract. We learn about tone through listening. That's the best way. Bright and dark really don't mean all that much if you don't know what I'm referring to. So taking the time to really listen to recordings thoughtfully and actively, that's going to help a lot. And developing our tone takes slow, thoughtful practice. It is a lifelong journey to find a tone that you're really happy with and what you feel represents you as a musician. But I promise it's very worthwhile and you'll probably have a lot of fun along the way. So on that note, happy practicing. Please get to it. And if you're interested in any of the resources I used for this presentation, here are some great resources for listening, reading, and practicing. Thank you for listening.